Tonight we're going to have some report backs. A few weeks ago, 23 of us from the Refugee Rights Action Network went to Leonora Detention Centre, as you can probably see from the photos that are scrolling through. And tonight we're going to have a report back from 4 of our people who actually got into that centre to visit with some of the people detained in that lovely facility. And I can tell you right from the very get-go, I didn't go in, but I saw it. It's not lovely. So we'll scroll through, and those people will speak for about 10 minutes or so, describe their experience, describe what they felt when they visited people in Leonora. We've also got a special guest star from the Refugee Action Coalition in New South Wales, Ian Rintoul. Some people may have seen him on the news, been involved in this stuff for quite a long time, certainly probably about as long as Peter and myself, probably about 10, 11 years maybe, something like that, but he's still a young man at heart. So we'll have a word from him just to kind of link us all, because this is a national campaign that we're part of, this is a movement that we're part of, and it's something that we really have to do if we're going to end this serious systemic injustice. But without further ado, I might call on Claire Middlemass, who will be our first speaker, who visited Leonora. Thank you very much.
Thing is rather awkward. I will just stand here. Sorry, please. Okay. Anyway, look, I'm just gonna let you know a little bit about what my experience was when I visited Leonora. So on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of August, 22 activists went up in a big orange school bus to Leonora Detention Centre. Some people like myself, this is the first time we've ever been to a detention centre. We're on a mission to bring toys and gifts to the families in detention there, and to highlight our government's disgusting policy of holding asylum seekers in detention. We got to Leonora on Saturday and we arrived at the detention centre, which was a prison in the middle of the desert, with a double fence and a lot of guards. The police had called for reinforcements, which included state police from Perth, to make sure our mission of giving gifts and toys didn't get too out of hand. Although we'd given advance notice of our visit, Serco, the security provider who run the centre, would only let 4 of us visit the detainees. And we were told we could only go in 2 at a time. The families inside the centre were really excited that we were coming, and we could see them from about 100 metres away from behind the fence. The children were hoisted up on the parents' shoulders, and they were waving and yelling to us. We laid the toys outside of the gate, as you can see in some of the pictures on here, and Serco guards came to process them, and we were told that they would be screened and processed, and we weren't given any time frame of how long that would take. So I was one of the 4 people to go in and visit. Myself and another activist, Victoria, wherever you are, Victoria, went in, and we actually met with a Hazara woman from Afghanistan. We went in there, we had to empty our pockets. Victoria even had to surrender her pen, because we all know the damage she can do with that. And we were swiped by metal detectors, and we were ushered through the fence. We're actually ushered past a fence with some mothers behind the fence. They were actually sticking out their hands, trying to pass us notes, and they were saying, "Hello, help us, help us." We weren't allowed to take the notes, and the guards yelled at the women, and and basically wouldn't let us interact with them. We were ushered into this grassed area where we could meet with the Hazara woman and a DAC translator, though he wasn't really needed because she spoke really good English. So she's a seamstress with 5 children. She fled Afghanistan fearing for her life and the lives of her children. She went to Malaysia, then Indonesia, then Christmas Island in a leaky boat, and then was transferred to Leonora. She said that she was very worried about her children, and she lives in limbo, not knowing whether she'll be granted a visa or when. The adults spend their days behind the wire fence, bored and unstimulated, with nothing to do. Nothing to do except worry about their fate. They've been asking for English lessons and have so far been denied. The children do go to school and participate in some organised sport, however they're still in prison. We're unable to visit with them, and despite some of our requests, we had some teachers going along with us, and we wanted to actually organise some games and activities for the kids, but Serco and DAC wouldn't let us do that. The parents are not allowed to cook for their families, they're not allowed to walk their children to school or freely visit the town of Leonora. The woman that we spoke to told us about how she tries to stay strong for her children's sake. She says that all she wants to do is be part of the Australian community and belong and be free. We promised to keep on fighting the government's inhumane policy, and we said that we wouldn't stop until the families in there were free. While Victoria and I were visiting, on the other side of the fence we could hear the voices of the children and teenagers who Serco would not allow us to visit, yelling, "Open the door, open the door." Our visit came to an end, and we hugged the woman we just met, and she thanked us for coming and for showing her that Australians do care and do welcome her to our country. We were ushered back outside the gate, and we actually stood there for hours waving to the families from afar while they held up handmade signs saying, "Welcome to Leonora Family Rejection Centre." So a few weeks ago, I witnessed the Labor government's refugee policy with my own eyes. I met with a woman who is a caring and strong mother who just wants her children to live in safety. She's actually not any different from you or I. She's actually done exactly what a person in her situation would do. She's fled to protect her family. But instead of welcoming her and her family to Australia and providing them with the support they need given the trauma they've endured, our government has locked her and her children away in the desert. Innocent people imprisoned without charge or trial, left to linger, unsure about what will happen to them. This is an absolute abuse of human rights, and it's happening in our backyard. I, for one, intend to keep the promise we made to her and continue to organise, to educate, to protest, and to keep fighting until the refugees are free. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I should have said at the beginning, at the end of our speakers, we will have plenty of time for questions and so forth, so a bit of a discussion at the end. So if people have got questions for any of the speakers, just hang on until the end, there'll be plenty of time. I'll now call on my great friend Nada, who went with us to Leonora and has unfortunately some experience of the Australian immigration detention system. But I'll call on Nada now, and if he wants to tell us about that experience, he certainly can.
Hi everyone. As a refugee, on behalf of all the refugees in detention, I have to thank you for everything that you have done so far for us. Well, I arrived to Australia around 10 years ago, and I always remember the bad experience of how I've been treated while I was a sick person. Because of asking for only one drink, I've been called by God as animal, that I'm not allowed to ask for drink. Inside myself, I asked myself that I came to Australia to ask for help. And I'm still on the way to the place to be processed. From now, they call me anyone. What's going to happen next? But I've been in detention center for more than 3 years. And as a result of that, I'm still suffering from major depression and anxiety. But I've been informed with my friends that there is like a trip that's going to happen to visit the people in detention. And I was more than happy to go with them. I've been told that the situation in detention now is very different. And I was like, had that in my mind that the Labor government would take care of the refugees and they will treat them in the best way as they promised to. So on the way to Leonora, I was driving my car and I pulled over by the police. And I've got that car for more than 2 years now. They asked me, do I own the car? And I said, yes. They said, no, the registration number doesn't suit with the car that you got. Anyway, fortunately I had a paper to prove that it was my car. From that time, I just got the picture of what's happened, how they're trying to cover up again the crap that they done in the past to me and my friends. I was restless. I just wanted to get in and see what's happening inside. So when we got to the center, well, I have decided there wasn't a razor wire, but all the scary process is still there. From the beginning, me and Kimber and Zaidi, we decided to go. And they brought the metal detector and they started just to search me. And he said to me, open your legs. I said, you don't need to tell me what to do. I know all this stupid thing. And he gave me like a dirty look. But I have to say, he was like very protective about his job and the situation. So when we started to go inside, I saw the green material all over the fence, which reminds me the same thing that I had in detention. And I said, yeah, there is no reason why there is guard and I have the green material. So I just, in my heart, got ready, for time that I'm going to face the same thing again. I visited around 10 people, and because of the ability that I've got, I can speak Arabic and Farsi as well as English, and sometimes I make fun of it and say Australian. When I said, I just look into their eyes and I could see the fear, and I just started to talk to them, and they were like in a position that they couldn't trust us. From the beginning they used to ask, who are you? What are you doing here? Why you came? So it took me a while to prove to them that we are here just for them. And then a guy, he was sitting next to me and he was holding his kids. And his tears he said, what can I do for my kid? She asked me to take her out. In the middle of the night, she's crying and she asked me to take her out. What can I do? I just asked for help. And I was like speechless. I just said, look, there is people out there that care about you, and we will do our best Another guy, he went to me and he said, my son is sick and they won't take him to a hospital. Another one, he said that I've got a sleepless problem. I just think about suicide. And I could see that the mental illness started to develop among them, and day by day that when they gonna spend time there, we have just to be ready for the time just to take care of them, because so far, which is 10 years ago till now, I'm suffering from it, and the government wouldn't take care of me. It was only you good people. We have to take care of them and we have to fight back together. And the message that they gave me to pass it through. They said there is two groups of people. One, they have got a good life and they try to make their life better. And they're not going to put their kids' life in danger. And there is other group which they have such a scary life and live in fear, in persecution, and they try to find to live safe, and they put their kids' life in danger. And they included themselves among the group number 2. They said, tell to Australian people, tell them, we are human like you. We promise to you that we would be a good resident of Australia, and we would put lots of effort to move Australia forward. I promised them I would do that, and since then I keep in touch with them, and I'm witnessing that day by day they started to develop new kind of sickness, such as heart condition, headaches, and attempting of suicide. I don't know really how to finish that, but humbly I just ask you, I know you try to help, every one of us do as much as you can. Thanks for everything, and thanks for your time.
Thanks for that, powerful stuff. Our next speaker, Kimber, went in with Nada during his visit, and I'd just like to introduce Kimber by giving a little anecdote. We were told when we actually went there that we could only have four visitors go in, 2 and 2, which is crap, because that does not happen at Villawood and it does not happen at Perth. It's an arbitrary rule made up on the spot. But Kimber went in and took young Zaylee with her, because in the inimitable wisdom of Diak and Serco, Zaylee doesn't count as a person. So she was allowed to go in, which I think says a lot about Leonora Detention Centre. I might call on Kimber to give us the heartfelts from her visit to Leonora.
Just just realised I'm wearing the same clothes. I do have more than one outfit. I haven't prepared a speech because I've had a pretty crappy day actually with my kids in my 3-person suburban box on my own, and to top it all off, I just got weed on by my baby. Which is, you know, what you get being a parent in Australia. And the man who we met with, Zaylee and I went in with Nada, and Nada, being one of these incredible people who can speak 3 languages, was able to communicate with a large group of men without one of the translators. I only speak Australian, so Zaylee and I went and sat with a Tamil man and his 7-year-old daughter. He's a father, and he's actually trapped in prison. And while I may feel from time to time that 4 walls of my house, or you know, more than 4 walls, because we've got lots of rooms and we're really lucky because we've actually got our own house, you know, that's a bit oppressive, and I sometimes feel like I'm trapped there, but I can leave and he can't, and neither can his children. And he was telling me about his family, his 7-year-old daughter who was sitting with us, and his 5-year-old daughter. And he said he was 30, same age as my children's father. And he told me that all his life he's been in detention. Back in Sri Lanka, he was in detention. His children were in detention. They weren't free to come and go. They live a life so different to the life that we live here. And he asked me why Australian people hate refugees. How do you answer that question? Aside from the fact that I'm not spokesperson for everyone in Australia, how do you answer the question when someone says, why do you hate me? And all I could say is, I don't. The people who are here with me don't. And the vast majority of Australians, I really believe, don't. And it's a real shame that the media and the politicians tell us that we do, because we don't, because they're people. They're parents and their children. And he told me that children who are in detention are developmentally delayed, which was so insightful for someone who is in such a terrible situation and in the middle of it, you know, like when I'm having a really terrible time, I can't see out of that fog. Yet he could, and he could explain to me that when his 6-year-old, she's turning 6 soon, gets out of detention, she'll be like my 3-year-old who hasn't been in detention. And the amount of development that happens with a young child, which, you know, I did understand sort of on an intellectual level before having children of my own, but now watching my child every single day, free to go about her life, free to sit on Nada's lap, and Marcus' lap, and sit with Karomi here, and, you know, just sort of flit around and be a little social butterfly. Watching her, and then watching her interact with the children who we visited in detention, because there were other children there as well. There was another little girl and a little boy who I think they were from Iran, and there was a much younger girl who was younger than Zaylee, also from Iran. And they didn't really interact with Zaylee. And the Tamil girl who we were sitting with eventually interacted with Zaylee, but not in the way that a child who is free to interact with other children without awaiting permission from the prison guard would. And that's the reality of it. I, at times, get a little bit vocal with my displeasure at my child. And I don't have to do that in front of a prison guard. The man I met does. If he wants to talk to his children, he wants to ask them not to do something, he wants to interact with them, he does it under the supervision of a prison guard. And that really, really undermines the respect that the children have for you. You work really hard to interact with your children respectfully and gain their respect, earn their respect, so that when you say, hey, don't touch that knife that's on the table, Zaylee, they're going to listen, and these kids, they don't have that. They don't have that relationship with their parents. They don't have that same freedom of ups and downs, because it's all down as far as I could see. And so this father who I met, he told me as a representative of the Tamil community that they had met and they'd written a list of things that they wanted to ask me to ask of the Australian people, free Australian people. First on that list was, please let our children live in your community. Please let our children live in homes that they can come and go freely from. I don't think that's much of an ask, and I don't think that children are much of a security risk, personally. Second thing he asked me was that there are lots of pregnant women in Leonora at the moment. And being in detention is taking its toll on them. Because pregnancy, it can be really lovely, and it's not a walk in the park, even an easy pregnancy, as I was so lucky to have with both of my children. You're tired and you have cravings for stupid stuff. And, to not have the freedom to duck down to the shop and get that stupid thing that you're craving, like vegetarian for 4.5 years and hey, I want a roast pork roll. They can't do that. He said that they don't have access to medical care that they feel they need. I think that as a woman who's expecting a child, you should be able to have as much or as little medical care as you want. I personally chose not to see a doctor. I personally chose not to see a doctor. Women in detention aren't choosing, they're just not seeing a doctor. I wasn't in prison when I was pregnant. I knew that if I had any concerns, I could go and see a doctor. I could get in to see a doctor like that. There's heaps of them available to me, living in a metropolitan area. In Leonora, we've found out that there's one doctor and one nurse for the entire town. That includes the people who are in detention. That includes the pregnant women who are in detention and the people with pre-existing medical conditions who are in detention. That includes the children who are in detention. They don't have the choice to see a doctor when they want to see a doctor, when they need to see a doctor. That's the second thing he asked me. Please let our pregnant women live in your community. Please let them have access to the healthcare that they want and that they need. Third thing, and he said, a little bit cheeky, this might be pushing it, but please let all of us live in your community. I don't think that's pushing it. He thought it was. He said, look, if you can't let all of us live in your community, as if it's my decision to make, please let our children and our pregnant women live in your community. Why is that so hard to provide? I promised him that I would share his story and that I would continue to push and push and push and ask and demand their freedom, and I wouldn't stop until they were free. Because it's not humane, it's not just. It breaches the UN Convention on the rights of the definition of a refugee. It also breaches the UN Convention on the rights of the children, because it explicitly states that children, in Article 37, I think, that children should not be detained. And if it is necessary that children are detained, that they are detained for the shortest amount of time possible. And the little girl who I saw, she's been in Australia for 2 months, and she's been detained for 2 months. It's now 3, because it was nearly a month ago that we went. He sent me an email recently, the man who I met with, and he said that they're not going to know whether or not they have a visa. They're living in limbo for at least another 2 or 3 months. And I cannot imagine my own children being detained for that long. I can't imagine my own children being detained for a week, because after 3 days of us not visiting people and just seeing each other, my child gets cabin fever. My 3-year-old child wants to go out and see people and interact with people. And you know, 3 days is probably our maximum, because day 3 I just go, all right, let's go. Let's just go out and let's find something to do. Because I have the right to do that, and I have the privilege of doing that. These people don't, and it's not right. And I'm going to keep on saying that to every single person I meet, and I'm going to keep on saying it until I've convinced them. Because it's not right, and it's not fair, and it's actually a violation of human rights, and it's a violation of a document that the Australian government have signed. So please, please, join us and help us to spread that word. And please help me fulfil the promise that I made to the father that I met.
Thank you very much for that, Kimber. I now call on Ian Rintoul from the Refugee Action Coalition. I keep wanting to say collective, I'm not too sure why, but coalition. Ian's, as I said before, a man that's been on the national scene around the refugee movement for a long time, and hopefully he can tie a few of the threads together. We've heard, basically, I think we've heard the core, the kernel of the problem tonight. Hopefully, you know, with a bit of discussion and what we have here from Ian, we might be able to think about where do we go from here. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Phil. I mean, I'd like to start too acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we gather tonight. There is, and always has been, a very close connection between the first Australians and the most recent Australians, and it is a tribute, I think, to the first Australians, and in spite of what the first boat people did to them for the last couple of 100 years, they've been able to see through the racism to extend the hand of welcome to the most recent Australians. And the people who sit in Canberra have a lot to learn from the response of Aboriginal people in Australia in that regard. I think you don't need me to tell you, many people went to Leonora, and what we've heard tonight has actually said a lot about the conditions that we have still got. I think the thing that is somewhat, I'm going to put it actually, but it's striking, is that understanding that people that sit in Canberra consciously and deliberately have recreated these conditions, allowed these conditions to continue in spite of the fact that the campaign that was waged the late 1990s into the 2000s, and we elected a government in 2007, and at least in some respects had made important changes, and there was an expectation that we're going to see far more serious changes from the Labor government. And yet we've now gone through an election period in which we've seen once again both sides of politics a bipartisan position, not in favour of freeing the refugees and ending mandatory detention, but re-establishing the bipartisan position which had created the circumstances which had allowed Howard to get away with temporary protection visas, which had taken mandatory detention Labor had started in the early 1990s and extend those kinds of things. And I don't think we should underestimate the kind of damage that actually happens in the community, the kind of racism that is established, the xenophobia that's established, the kind of political climate which allows very ugly kinds of policies and attitudes to arise. And it's going to take very conscious efforts on our part and other people's parts to undo the damage that we've seen over that last period. We know now that regardless of which minority government comes out of this election process, that there are rotten refugee policies which are going to have to be fought. Notwithstanding, I think it's wonderful that Adam Bandt is in the lower house of the Parliament. I think it's great that he might get the chance to move a private member's bill about that, but I'm also very confident that they haven't got the numbers and that all the Liberal Labor have to do is combine to ensure that those things go absolutely nowhere. It's somewhat of a privilege, I think, to be amongst people, some of whom have worked much longer than I have over these kinds of issues. People who I've only known over the phone, talked over the phone about how we can campaign, sort of across the country to change these things. Some people that I've met previously, where we've had to converge in the middle of Australia to see what we could do about pulling down some of the fences, at the time. The tragedy is that those fences are, the fences are still there. I think there's two particular things now. I think, given the recognition that we are going to have to continue to campaign, I think we have to take, firstly, a hell of a lot of sustenance from the campaign last time. The fact is, in the teeth of the Howard government, who was absolutely determined to whip up the anti-refugee racism, to establish the xenophobia, to create the Islamophobia, to divide the Australian community, there was a grassroots campaign that rose to that challenge, and in the face of what was then also a bipartisan support for those policies of temporary protection visas and mandatory detention, we actually managed to win some very important changes. And even when the Howard government was still in place, we actually got some people out of the long-term detainees come out. The children and grandmas actually came out of detention, actually came out of detention. Not the fiction that we're given now, that there are no women and children in detention. We got them out of detention. And I think perhaps our finest moment, and I think probably in terms of the campaign overall, was when they introduced the legislation that was going to excise the whole of Australia from the Operation of Migration Act. That legislation was withdrawn from the Senate by the Howard government because they knew it was going to be defeated. And that was, I think, a very good example of the way in which, in spite of there being a Liberal government, in spite of being a very determined government to drive those things through, a grassroots campaign could make enormous changes. And I think it wasn't just at that level. I think perhaps the most important thing we did was that we shifted public opinion. And that by the grassroots campaign that we did, tens of thousands of people started to understand what detention actually meant. What it meant for the detainees, what it meant for women and children, and what it meant for the Australian community. The way in which those kinds of divisive attitudes could tear the community apart. And I think that's one of the things they're still attempting to do that, I think. They try to pretend there's kind of an us and them, in this process. Like, well, you're okay, we're all being looked after, and they're the people who are jumping the queue, they're the people who, threaten our way of life or whatever. And I think we have to say very, very clearly, in the same way they try to do it with the Aboriginal people. When those people come to Australia, it's not us and them anymore. They're our rights. Right? They're part of our community. They're part of what the government is attempting to do is part of us. And there's no us and them, in spite of the fact that they put fences and they put ideology, sort of between us. And I think the campaign has to as it did in the past, like reach over that wire and through that wire to make it very clear, that they may want to stop the boats, but there's going to be ropes and there's going to be hands that are going to be extended back to make sure the boats actually can come here and people are going to be welcome in Australia. I suppose there's a couple of little things, not little things I think. I think the most immediate things we've got, first of all, is the offshore processing. And I think that's something which has to be addressed, and there's a very important reason for that. Because when the Labor Party made some of those changes, the most significant thing is that they left the very pillars of what we're now experiencing in place. They left mandatory detention in place, they left offshore processing in place. And what it meant was that the basis of the injustices which were inflicted on the asylum seekers continued. So women and children may have been out under those previous policies, but they weren't out under offshore processing, because offshore processing creates a completely different processing arrangement. People are excised from the Migration Act. They don't have access to the Australian courts, and the offshore processing arrangement is subject to, as obviously subject to political manipulation. We saw the rejection rates for Tamils and for the Afghans. The Afghans were close to 100%. Before April the 9th, 2010, and that's why a lot of people were prepared to put up with offshore processing, because at some level it was still working, right? In spite of the thing, but there were plenty of examples where it wasn't working as well, which gave us the danger signs of what was going to happen. But April the 9th, when the Labor government declared that there was going to be a freeze on Afghan visas and Sri Lankan visas, the rejection rates accelerated after that. Not that it had anything to do with the visa freeze. In fact, they could have put the visa freeze and there's no reason that the rejection rates needed to shift. The circumstances in the countries haven't changed. The circumstances of their arrival haven't changed. There was one reason that changed, and that's because the political masters dictated to a refugee processing arrangement which isn't transparent, which is not subject to judicial review, which is not subject to that kind of oversight. They got the message, and the rejection rates skyrocketed. And we also know, by the fact that certainly amongst the Afghans, I haven't got any figures, maybe Rosemary knows about the Tamils, but certainly amongst the Afghans, we're now getting 70, 80, and sometimes 90% of those rejections being overturned. Now, in any other arena of government policy or anything else like that, if you looked at conviction rates on whatever happened to be drink driving, being overturned at the rates of 90%. There would be questions about how on earth are people being convicted in the first place. Those questions aren't being asked. They're not being asked because it actually points to the fact that it is subject to political manipulation. The processing is arbitrary, and it is far, far from independent. That's why one of the important things which is happening, I think we're probably aware of it, there is a High Court case now. We're going to wait for the decision. We're probably waiting for 2 or 3 months, perhaps longer, the lawyers think, although I think there's a good chance of success out of that High Court case over the question of whether it's illegal. Now we hope, we're not sure process is illegal. Now we hope, of course, that the High Court is going to find in our favour, and if it does find in our favour, then many of the people who rejected will get the chance to put their cases again. But don't think even if that happens, so sort of minds not wiser than ours, that's certainly not true, more devious, more manipulative, more scheming, already inside the department trying to work out how they can make offshore processing actually fit for whatever decision from the High Court. So we're not going to get justice from the High Court. We may get an opportunity to expose some of the injustices associated with the processing arrangement, but we have to seize that kind of opportunity. We also know that in Curtin and other places, in Leonora, you have got I'm not sure quite what the figure is. It would certainly be over 1,000 people. Afghans who are now subject to the visa freeze, and more people are continuing to rise to add to those numbers. So I think there are two kind of immediate things: the question of offshore processing, the question of the visa freeze on the Afghans that we have to put at the front of what we can campaign around. I think there is the other thing, which has obviously been the subject of a lot of the things tonight, is that it is a lie that women and children are not behind wire. There may not be razor wire in every place. There's still some razor wire that people exist behind, and the fact that they call them alternative places of detention to create some kind of technical fiction that people are not in detention centres doesn't alter the fact that people here, now know and knew previously. The women and children are in detention. We were told that they weren't going to be in detention. They are. And I think that I think people may not know, but I think the experience of Leonora, and I think we owe a tribute to the people whose idea it was and the people who went up there. But the way in which the trip to Leonora has lifted the lid on the real conditions that are happening inside Leonora has actually sent a message, very, very widely, in a way in which we've been talking to people around children are still in detention. Here's what's happening in the family compound in Christmas Island. It's not gazetted as a detention centre, so they claim that people aren't in detention, but they are in detention. People cannot come and go. They can't go and play in the playground unless there's a guard. So most often they don't go and play in the playground even though they can see it, through the wire. It's detention. Oh yeah, well maybe, and we try, make other arguments when the families got put in the transit accommodation and stuff, and they call it transit accommodation. There's nothing transit about it, and it's not very accommodating. It's the same kind of thing. It's just like Leonora. They take over a bit of the motel, the Virginia Palms Motel in Brisbane, run a wire around it, put the shade, you can't see in and out, people in the community can't go in for all the kinds of reasons you experience that. Leonora, there's been a recent thing in Brisbane where people wanted to assemble clothes and all kinds of things like that. It took weeks of negotiation, even to try and still couldn't go in because it didn't have a name of someone inside, couldn't make that kind of contact, even to get them to accept that it was okay to deliver it somewhere for that material, those goods to go inside. So. I think and now we're seeing, people again, sort of first hand, Leonora, but all the things that detention does to people is happening again, on a larger scale, and from what we can gather, happens on a quicker scale. Whereas people's happening after many months, it's happening in a much shorter space of time, for the people who are coming now. And I think when we look at the situation, the protest in Darwin, and I think there's two aspects about that. One is that they were told when they were shifted from Christmas Island to Darwin that they were on an approval pathway. People went to Darwin expecting that was the first step to a visa and the first step to going into the Australian community. Within days almost of them arriving in Darwin. 5 days? Days of them arriving in Darwin, the rejection started to mount, and the last couple of weeks from the little information we've been able to get out from inside, those rejections have increased a lot. Increased kind of markedly. And it's those kinds of conditions of people, not just the disappointment, but the anxiety, the uncertainty, the fear of what's taken place has given us in Darwin what we saw happen in Woomera, in Port Hedland, in Curtin. The people are driven to protest, they have a right to protest, they're driven to protest by those kinds of conditions, and the government's response to that is to vilify them even further, to attempt to paint them as criminals and destroyers of property, and to uproot them and put them into Curtin. And I don't really care what the government says, it is a form of collective punishment. The fact that people overnight can be taken to Darwin, plonked down, is just reinforces that we control you. We make the decisions. What happens to you is determined by us. It doesn't matter what connections you may have been to the Christmas Island Darwin, we will make the decision. And it creates the vulnerability, the anxiety, the uncertainty of what is going to happen, even if their processes, if they thought they could believe the processes, if they had trust in any kind of aspect of the processes, the fact that that's been pulled out from them by the rejections, and now by that kind of shift says something about, again, why we have to take that on. I just wanted to finish with some of the experiences from last time round, because it can seem like a bit of a bleak picture. That we've got two sides of the politics actually talking about making things worse for refugees and not better. That the consequences of that are becoming more obvious to people. But as I said before, I think we need to learn from the campaign last time. I don't think there's any reason to be despondent. The fact that the Leonora Cavalcade has been the catalyst that has seen Children Out actually reform, Children Out of Detention reform. They said in when was it? 2005, we won. The children were out of detention. There's no reason for us anymore. They disbanded against some sort of argument from our side of things. Perhaps it wasn't such a good idea, and nonetheless that's what's happened. But it was, in spite of all the argument, it was the experience of Leonora, the reality of Leonora. We said, we're going to have to do something again. There are now groups like RAN, like Refugee Action Collectives and Refugee Action Coalitions, all over the country, which are now active again, recognise the need to get up and campaign and take the message out. And I think that's what we need to take to heart. Public opinion is not set in concrete. in spite of the bipartisan position the government's put, it can be fought and it can be turned around. And it seems like sometimes small beer, for us, but and it sometimes seems that way. You think of what you're up against, the razor wire, the institutions, the immigration department, the federal parliament, the political parties, those little fact sheets that we carry are enormously important. A little fact, a little bit of truth actually can bring down, the screens that they put up around to try and stop us seeing what's actually happening inside the detention centres, inside the immigration department. And I think we have to look now about how we go about those things, using the fact sheets, looking at other places where we can get that message across, the meetings that we can have, I don't know exactly where we are geographically, but we go from North Perth into University of Western Australia, PWA, into Curtin, into Murdoch, and we'll find people again, who want to know what's happening, who will resonate with, and we can start to establish little students groups. We want to go to the unions because the powers that be really think that they've got an audience in, I don't know the equivalent here either, but when Gillard talked about the Western Sydney, the racists in Western Sydney, the rednecks in Western Sydney, the reason that they had to manoeuvre, was because there was some kind of attitude in the Australian community. Actually, the attitude is not in the Australian community. We know that there are racists in the Australian community, but we also know that those ideas can be changed. Right? And if the people at the top are not going to do it, then we know that we can do it, and then we can go out about change, go out to actually change that. So we need to look at the unions, because they have a particular importance in terms of their connection with the organised working class, the ability to resist the place where they want to sink those arguments most deeply. So we need to go back to the unions, talk to them about why refugees is a union issue. When they try to divide, when they try to use racism and xenophobia to divide the community, they're trying to divide our very ability to resist and to fight back over all kinds of those social justice and working conditions. And we can do what we did last time: go to the teachers, get resolutions through the unions, talk to the different teachers, whether we can have meetings at their schools, get little groupings in the schools, get the connections between the teachers and the students. Excuse me, over those issues. And the same with the community groups. Again, to repeat what we've done in the past, produce the leaflets in different languages. Go to the different community groups. They're not necessarily meeting about refugees, but where they're meeting, where they're talking about issues that matter for them, we need to be there talking about the refugee issues and how we can actually fight back. And I think out of that process, as I said, we know, in spite of the government last time, in spite of what Howard tried to do, we were able to win enormous kinds of changes. This time around, I think we've got one other thing to our advantage, and that is that there were tens of thousands of people who were involved in the campaign last time in some kind of way, who wrote letters, who sent parcels, who visited, organised the protests, organised the lobbies, produced the fact sheets, organised the convergences and the protests and all those kinds of things. And we described at the time that so many tributaries running into an enormous river, which in the end was able to shift the government and to change that public opinion. We can create that again. And I think that's what we need to take some encouragement from that. And when I see Nada here, and it was their resistance last time which provided so much encouragement for the campaign outside, to realise that they had a determination to fight over all that they were doing. And hear the stories about what people inside the detention centres are actually saying. I think again we can draw some encouragement of the possibilities of this time around of campaigning so that we don't leave offshore processing or mandatory detention or some other little pillar about the unjust refugee policy. This time around, I think we have to uproot every fence post of the detention centre. We have to uproot every pillar of those things that they use to divide us. When they talk about the people not stopping the boats, we have to say the boats are welcome here. The regional processing centre, I don't believe it won't happen, but if it does happen, it won't be because it's a way of extending refugee rights, it's actually a way of denying refugee rights. And so I want to finish on my little thing because I think it is particularly important. In Darwin, it wasn't just the Afghans. And the Afghans broke out of the detention centre and they stood with their very compelling sheets and signs on the Stewart Highway. But a couple of days before that, we also saw a protest by Asian fishermen who set fire to a couple of mattresses, stood up on the roof and talked about the injustice that was being inflicted on them. And I think we have seen over and over again where it's trying to tie asylum seekers with terrorists. This time around it's trying to portray asylum seekers as somehow criminalised. They criminalise them by associating them with the evil, vile people smugglers. The fishermen who bring those boats, who cruise those boats, are not evil, vile people smugglers. they provide an absolutely important task for people who have no other way of getting somewhere where they get protection. And until the Australian government is willing to use their own ships and their own planes to bring people from Malaysia and Indonesia, wherever they happen to be, to Australia where they can be protected, people are going to continue to use people smuggling. So I think we have to demand that those Asian fishermen should be released. There should be no charges about people smuggling against them, and in fact the Australian government should get rid of the people smuggling laws. They're not designed to stop people coming here. They're designed as part of the attempt to criminalise asylum seekers inside Australia. So it's for domestic consumption. It's part and parcel of their arguments about why we shouldn't support asylum seekers. And like the other arguments they've made in the past attempting to asylum with terrorists, that has to come down. So we look forward to continuing the campaign. We've talked to a lot of people over the phone, but there is that campaign out there. We now can build those much stronger networks, build the kind of thing we saw last time, to have much greater confidence. This time around we can win the same kinds of changes on the same kind of scale that we saw last time, but I think even bigger this time around. And one thing, I don't know whether you've discussed it yet, but Sydney Refugee Action Coalition has set the 23rd of October as their next kind of major mobilisation, because it ties in with a couple of things. Very close to the anniversary of CivX, and the consequences of what that did, a very graphic description of what the consequences of the policy last time actually meant. And it also coincides with an anniversary of the Indonesian solution and tying back the attempt to tow back the Tamil asylum boat back to Iraq, and it's also with a year of the oceanic Viking people as well, who are still sort of haven't got visas because they're supposedly national security risks. So I'm sure there's only plenty of opportunities to campaign together. I think we should take some sustenance. There are those national networks, and we can build a campaign this time every bit as successful as as last time. So thanks very much for having me. I look forward to all the phone calls and the connections and that.
Thank you to Ian, who did that probably on about 2 hours sleep because he flew in this morning from Sydney. Ian did mention fact sheets, which we have got on our back table there, so before you leave tonight, grab them. Before we start the discussion, which we've got plenty of time for, I would also like to give a plug to dictionaries for detainees, because one of the promises that was made to people in Leonora was that dictionaries would be provided by them. Tamil English dictionaries and Hazara English dictionaries as well. Yeah, so basically, so people can start to communicate. The website for that is dictionariesfordetainees.com. Dictionaries for detainees, all one word. It's on the flyer here if people want to check that. Please, we want your flesh and blood, but if you can't give us that, or if you want to give us more, we also want your money as well. There's plenty of time for discussion. Basically, stick up your hand and I'll call on you. Try and keep in mind brevity is wit, and I won't put an actual time limit on there, but if you want to make a statement or ask a question to the people who visited, please feel free. So I'll now open the floor for some discussion. Stick your hands up and ask questions, whatever. Kimber,
I remembered a bit that I forgot. It's really important. Can I tell it? Really have it ready because it's really important. It's about kids. When we went in there, one of the Serco guards asked me if I wanted a toy for Zaylee. And I said, are there any toys that they can play with together? Because I'd seen that there are other children in there. And he said, no, does she want a toy? And I said, no, she'll be fine playing without one. So they were going to give the little blonde, blue-eyed, white kid a toy, and they weren't going to give toys to the children who are in detention. I think that's really important, and I forgot it.
It was in your blog.
It is, yeah, and I heard about it, so...
Sorry.
I'll give you the link to that.
If for any more information or to get in touch with us after tonight, you can simply go to rran.org. On that link, on that site, we've got a blog post where you can read Kimber's story. You can read accounts of others who went as well. Not necessarily those who visited, but the experience of just going up to Leonora. By the way, my name's Tonya. Sorry. And also on that website you'll find a link to dictionaries for detainees. You'll find a link to our PayPal account where you can donate if you like. And any upcoming news, there'll be information about our upcoming meetings, any upcoming actions. They go straight up on the website. You can join us on Twitter, you can join us on Facebook. We're across all that social networking stuff. Cool.
Thank you, Tonya. Tonya does a mighty job with our website and the Facebook stuff, so thank you very much. Yeah, Peter.
I would have a question for Rosemary if she doesn't mind answering. Could you let us, could you enlighten us, maybe what the appeal rates and things are for the Sri Lankans at the moment? Or roughly?
They're very, very low because they're being held up with their security checks. So any approvals are being any vaguely positive outcomes for people are just going back. So I just that's the piece of information that I have. I don't have the number in my head, but I can certainly probably tell you tomorrow or something. But it's very low because of the security check stuff. It's just horrendously.
So ASIO asks the people that they're fleeing from, are these people a security risk?
Yes, I just want to add that. Have these people got a criminal record is the question that they ask. And of course, the Sri Lankan Embassy in Australia provides the information, as you can see, in a very non-partisan way in our media. Oh, sorry, I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek here. And it's very difficult. But it's also, from another point of view, these the Tamil Tigers were a proscribed organisation in Australia, and there's been a long-term argument with ASIO in Australia, and we've written to all of the appropriate ministers who write us all ridiculous garbage back, but there just has to be some way of breaking this impasse where the oppressors who won the war, can't kind of keep reoppressing the people who escaped from them. And it's very difficult, and it's really difficult with a young family in Christmas Island who have failed that security check off the Oceanic Viking. And I met with them when I was in Christmas Island, and that's a really, really difficult story. And you wonder how long are we going to keep people in prison, maybe it's Guantanamo.
For the rest of their natural life.
Well, and how does that square with the Convention on the Rights of the Child? And when will we take that case to court? I mean, the Uniting Church is representing one of the people in the High Court in this case about have they got the right to use this different process under Australian law, which Ian was talking about. We hope that the first of those cases will have some positive outcome in that way. But pro bono lawyers who can do this stuff for us are, they will do what they can, like all of us. We do all of that we can, and then there's just a limit to it. So clearly that's obviously the next High Court challenge.
Interestingly enough, just because you do sort of hear whispers of it in the media about the Tamil, the war in Sri Lanka is over now and the Tamils can go back. But what Rosemary just said there about her description of the war, if she was in Sri Lanka, that would probably be enough to get her branded as a Tamil tiger and put her in serious trouble with the government, the way she just described the war then, which we just all happily accepted. To do that in Sri Lanka, she'd have problems. That's the kind of place that we want to send people back to. So it's just interesting to keep in mind that one comment from somebody from the Uniting Church would have been enough to get them branded as a Tamil tiger in Sri Lanka.
We just had someone from the Uniting Church visiting Sri Lanka, and interestingly enough, the Uniting Church usually makes a big public statement after we've been somewhere. You'll notice it's not there. And we're thoughtful about it not being there because the people who took our visitor there would be in danger if he actually said. But the issues are full and compromising for the Tamil people, all Tamil people in the area, and actually any other people, the Sinhalese people who are supporting them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Jack?
Yeah, I just want to raise some openings, hopeful openings with the new minority government. Up till now we've had either of the major parties take the backbench for granted and just bully stuff through if they had a majority. I know that the Greens want accountability structures for ASIO. And I know that also Rob Oakeshott wants onshore processing. He wants to end the offshore processing. Tony Windsor is probably going to fall in with him on that. So if Labour doesn't have the indecency to call on the help of the nasty bastard Liberals to push things through, they cannot pass stuff without the approval of the Independents and the Greens. So there's hopeful stuff happening there. I've already been in touch with the Independents, I've sent them stuff. I've been on the phone to one of the Labour ministers, and I, for the hell, can't remember his bloody name, but there was talk the other day about Tony Abbott pushing through Nauru without regulation. And there is a possibility to stop this if Labour wins government by drafting a bill, quick smart, to forbid the offshore processing that is proposed, the model is proposed by Tony Abbott. If that bill gets the support, and it will get the support from people like Judy Moylan and some other backbenchers in the Liberal Party, then Tony Abbott won't have a chance to push through with Nauru. So there's possibilities, and I'm always advocating to be in touch with some decent politicians, and I've had success with that. With Judy Moylan being my local member, she's now gone, of course, but you know, I claim a little bit of teeny 1 million of her credit for kicking Iron Bar Tucky out of the Parliament, so that feels good.
He'll be sorely missed, I'm sure, by my attitude group. Tonya.
Can you let people know the status of the gifts that we took up to Leonora?
And the letters.
And yeah.
Not good, basically. From what I can gather, very little of the toys we took up are actually getting to the people inside Leonora. And if they are getting to the people inside Leonora, it's, as Kimber was saying, it's sort of regulated by Serco. So here you go, it's 9 o'clock, you can have a toy. Okay, it's 4 o'clock now, give it back. And I'm not joking about that. That is how the toys are regulated. So basically, and that's just a savage indictment of a bureaucracy that can treat people like that. On the letters, there's two things in letters. I might let someone. We took letters from primary school students up to give to the detainees to kind of refute the idea that people hated them. That was like, perhaps one of the visitors wants to elaborate on this, that was like pulling teeth getting those things in. I'm still not entirely sure what the hell happened to those. But the other letters I would like to mention is, and I think it was maybe Claire mentioned it, the notes that were tried to pass to us from mothers inside as our visitors went in, and notes were tried to pass to us and people yelled at their mothers, no, no, no. We sort of said, oh, well, can we get those notes? Because obviously they're for us. Someone hands you something, it's for you. And they said, oh, there's no such thing as notes, they must be letters. I said, fair enough then. Can you post them to us? A member of our beloved constabulary, the State Security Unit, wrote down my address so these could be sent to us. He was under the impression that there were letters to be sent to us. He was talking to the Serco Centre Manager, and this, you know, very senior police officer was under the impression that letters were to be sent to us. That's why he took my address. When I contacted the Centre Manager about a week or two ago, he said, what letters? What letters? So they've disappeared. So that's, again, some of the bloody-minded bureaucracy. And maybe, Victoria, you can elaborate some of that?
Well, yeah, because the women that Claire and I visited with also had a letter for us. And she very specifically wanted to give us the letter, which she had left in her room. I mean, you can understand that although people were thrilled we were coming up to visit, they were also quite confused about when it was going to happen, how things were going to happen, and of course the level of police presence. And I think from everything everyone has said, what I would want anyone who didn't actually go up there and didn't actually go in to understand is the level of police presence. That's the thing that makes it the prison, not the absence or presence of razor wire. It's the regimen that people are under, the fact that they You know, she wanted to go back to her room to get this letter that she'd written for us, and letters that other people had given her. So not just the ones that people tried to pass to us, that they were yelled at. And we were told that if we tried to interact with people who were trying to push their way through to us through this little gap where there was no Hessian covering the fence, which obviously was there to restrict people's view. And they wouldn't let her go to the room to get the letter for us. It's also those letters that specifically were for her visitors that we were then told we could collect the next day, or would be got for us and we could collect the next day at the office. Well, we all know that didn't happen. You know, and even things like, I mean, the one thing I also wanted to mention is that when we wanted to check about, you know, what sorts of things we could bring in for people, and they're going to start this sewing group. So I asked, well, can we send some sewing supplies in? And the initial response was no. And I said, well, what about fabric? Oh, yeah, you can send fabric in. Well, what can't we send in? We can't send in anything sharp because only 3 people at a time under supervision can handle scissors and needles, and we couldn't send scissors or needles. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but that kind of sounds like a prison to me when you're not allowed to have, you know, and you've also got to understand the dongas that people are living in. It's not like you have control over who comes and goes. And the other thing that we heard and that people in the town had said as well was, you know, the fact that these women resented the fact that people could come and go in and out of their homes to clean, to check on them, to muster them. And we also know that there had been words exchanged, shall we say, between Serco staff and fathers around privacy sorts of issues. I mean, that's the other thing, is people don't have any privacy. You've got prison guards coming and going at will.
And it's cultural issues.
And there's cultural issues around, absolutely, around privacy with Islamic women and some of these men as well. I also just wanted to say that not 4 days before the election, I think just across the hall here, I exchanged rather heated words. Rather heated words. I thought I was very restrained with a certain Chris Evans, and who as good as called me a liar in public. And again, I think the thing that
I had a hit.
well, he was clearly rattled because we are making public statements that are essentially calling him a liar, and I didn't say you're a liar, but I as good as said it. I described the conditions in Leonora to the people in the room, and I once again looked directly at him and challenged him and said, your government promised, there were people who voted for your government based on the promise that children would not be in detention. I've been to Leonora. It is not prison-like conditions. It is a prison. And he said, well, they have excursions, and they go to school. And I said, and they come back every night to a prison. So we have rattled him. And I think we have to continue rattling. It is really important to put pressure at every pressure point we can. And I think we have really opened a bit of a lid. And I'd reflect a bit of what Ian said. I think we can win this battle. But I'd actually also say, I think we're 10 steps ahead of where we were last time around.
We're a lot faster.
The media came to us, were interested in what we had to say. I was really impressed with the clip that Channel 7 chose to play. And the media, the journalists are really pissed off. And we can see that when we look at what they're twittering, where they're going, Diak says this. They say, I have to call it an APOD and not a detention center. Piss off. I think, much more open to our point of view this time around. They were up there. We had times where we had no media coverage, or where the media coverage was frankly hostile. We had media coming to us this time around. They were not hostile, and they were also really pissed off that DIAC, and I know I'm pretty pissed off because I don't like being called a liar in public. And we've got Sandy Logan from DIAC still saying to the media, we didn't get in, we didn't talk to anybody. And my comment to each and every person in the media I spoke to when they came back to me with that was, and if they'll lie to you about that, what else do you think they might be lying to you about?
You're not really inside there?
I'm not really inside.
This
It
is
really
just trick
go.
photography.
It's all a fantasy.
I'll just call on Robin.
You probably know, I know an awful lot of Aboriginal people in that town, and I know they have extremely strong views about the detention centre and the families there, but what I can express that in a minute if you want me to, but what I want to ask is, of those that went to Leonora, did you actually talk to any of the townspeople?
Yes. Yes.
Actually, maybe Marcus, because Marcus actually met with Geraldine, so...
Yeah, Marcus.
So, yeah, either or.
Yeah, we did. We met with someone who was presented to us as being as much of a representative of the Indigenous community as we could get for, last minute notice.
The elders were out of town.
Yeah.
We had contacted.
Do you know who it was?
Can you remember what her name was?
Lillian?
Geraldine, wasn't it?
Geraldine Hogar.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But
And Michelle.
Madam Michelle, yeah, she worked in the detention centre as well as a cleaner. Look, they had put it to us that they said these are just families, they're just parents with their kids. And Michelle said, I think because we're Aboriginal and they've got culture and we've got culture, we can really connect with what it is, with who these people are. You said we've been talking to immigration about trying to get some cultural exchange, which has apparently been received well but hasn't been organised yet, but hopefully that will take place. And they said they get along with the kids really well in the school, and they said we can speak on behalf of our families, and probably, I think the line was, in the town there's probably about 70-80% of the town support the asylum seekers, and that's probably because about 70% of the town are Aboriginal, was her way she put it. So basically the people that she's saying, it's the rednecks who are very much a small minority, minority. It's just
there are some whites that support it as well.
But, yeah.
But it's like she's between a rock and a hard place, because without the detention centre, she wouldn't have a job. So, but she did feel that it was a little bit invasive because she had to go in and clean the rooms of families, and she didn't feel comfortable about doing that because the women were saying, "Oh no, you don't have to worry about doing that," but she was being paid for it. So, and also with Ramadan, because Ramadan was just coming up as well, so she was a little bit concerned about that, and having to move prayer mats to vacuum, and ensuring that she tried to ensure that their prayer mats were put back in the same place, and so there was those difficulties.
Well, I don't even know that across the road is what they call the Aboriginal village. I mean, the living conditions for those people were appalling as well. And so I think they empathise very much with what they see as another group of oppressed people. But I mean, it wasn't just Geraldine. I know a lot of the elders there, and they do feel really strongly. I've heard them talk about many things over the years, but this comes through very, very powerfully. I think it was the fact of seeing children really affected them. And I know that they put to the authorities there that they wanted family barbecues outside the detention centre, and the authorities said thanks, but that's not really very feasible, and that sort of thing. So it's frustrating them enormously. But the comments they made most commonly were the irony of the first lot of boat people should be so anti-boat people, it just doesn't make sense. There's a lot of things, but I won't.
I just want to clarify something. It wasn't actually Geraldine we spoke to. I spoke to Geraldine on the phone before we went.
Oh, yeah.
Geraldine goes bush every weekend.
Yeah, she does.
So I spoke to Geraldine and Kate O'Neill before we went up there. And unfortunately, both of them and Richard Evans weren't in town that weekend. And the lady that we were put on to, is it Maxine? No?
Maxine, could have been Maxine.
Yeah, I can't remember. Michelle, I thought it was like Laura or Lisa or something like that.
We were put on to her by the sergeant, the police sergeant, who actually had spoken to her before he, to ask her if it was okay if a couple of us went up and spoke to her. So we went up and just sat on the veranda with them and just had a 20-minute chat.
Yeah. And also, within days of Leonora opening, I got book orders from the school. By the way, I'm Jack. I run a thing called Project Safe. We sell books from our website about refugee issues. And so within days of Leonora opening, we got some orders from the high school for books. So there's some teachers doing lesson plans about refugees with the kids.
Some of the staff came to Karad and got resources as well from us.
Probably the same.
Before they went up there, you know, they appointed new staff because of kind of new flux of group. So fund the school teachers.
There's some positive signs there because I think we got some positive feedback from some of the teachers that were there.
And from the families as well, one of the things they didn't complain about was the way that the school and the headmistress of the school had been really trying hard to make them welcome, to appreciate the needs of children and families. And again, that's quite different from what we saw and heard up at Port Hedland, where once the kids in Port Hedland were allowed into the local school, it was not all smooth.
Okay. I might sort of call an end to it because it's 25 past 8, but I would encourage people to stick around and have a chat to people one-on-one if you want to do that. There is information up the back there. Talk to people here about dictionaries for the detainees and the website, and please stay in touch with us because we do need to continue this campaign. And Kimber said it and I say it time and time again, but I'm really not kidding. We are not going to give up until the pillars that Ian was referring to are all ripped up and thrown into the sea and are in the Mariana Trench. So thank you all.